Back in the 19th century, America was gripped by this utopian fever. I mean, thousands of people were absolutely convinced that the world as they knew it was broken. So what did they do? They set out on this wild, radical quest to build heaven right here on Earth. So yeah, let's dive into this incredible period of social experimentation.
I mean, really, think about it for a second. What would your perfect society look like? Would you want more freedom? Or maybe less? What about the rules for family, for work, for faith? It's a question that feels kind of abstract to us now, right? But for this brief, super intense period in American history, that was the most important question you could ask.
And these folks, they weren't just dreaming. They weren't just writing angry pamphlets or debating in coffee houses. No way. They were actually out there, buying up huge chunks of land, completely rewriting the rules of sex, marriage, and property, and creating some of the most fascinating and frankly bizarre communities you could ever imagine.
Okay, so you've got to be wondering, where did all this energy come from? Well, it all kicks off with a massive religious revival that just swept across the nation.
You have to understand, the country was transforming at this absolutely breakneck pace. I mean, the old ways of doing things were just crumbling, and a lot of people felt anxious, kind of lost at sea. And right into that chaos comes the Second Great Awakening, and it offers this incredibly powerful answer. Hey, you can take control, you can perfect yourself, and you can perfect the world around you.
And listen, this is the absolute key to understanding everything that follows. The core idea driving all of this was something called perfectionism. And the belief was simple, but radical. It wasn't about just being good and waiting for heaven after you die. Nope. It was about building a perfect, totally sin-free society right here, right now. And that one idea, it basically lit the fuse for dozens of these wild social experiments.
So, okay, if you're going to try and perfect all of society, where do you start? Well, you have to go right for its most basic building block, the family. And a lot of these groups looked at traditional marriage and thought this is completely broken. And the solutions they came up with, whoa, they were truly radical.
And I mean, they went to incredible extremes. On one side, you had groups that saw sex as literally the root of all evil, so their answer was simple. Get rid of it. Total celibacy. But on the other side, you had groups that did the exact opposite. They radically expanded the whole idea of marriage, believing that was the real key to spiritual enlightenment. It's wild, right? They're trying to solve the same problem with completely opposite answers.
All right, let's start with the Shakers. Their leader was a woman named Ann Lee, and for them, the problem was clear. Sin entered the world through sex, so the solution was just as clear. Get rid of it, completely. They lived communally, but men and women lived apart. And they were famous for this really ecstatic, trembling style of worship, which, you guessed it, is how they got the name Shakers.
Then you had the Harmony Society, also known as the Rappites. They were on a really similar path, all about celibacy. Their leader, George Rapp, was seen as this prophet basically chosen by God, and they were serious about it. Even married couples had to live like they were just brother and sister, pouring all that energy into getting ready for the second coming of Christ. And then, well, you have the complete and total opposite. This quote here from John Humphrey Noyes, he's the founder of the Oneida community, it just captures his whole philosophy perfectly. See, he wasn't trying to get rid of sex. He was reimagining it as, well, like a communal feast.
So, the Oneida community practiced something they called complex marriage. Basically, every man in the community was married to every woman, and every woman was married to every man, no exceptions. For them, falling in love with just one person was a form of selfish sin. It was one of the most radical social experiments in all of American history. And get this, the whole thing was financed by making silverware. Seriously.
Now, the Mormons, founded by Joseph Smith, they were also all about redefining society, but they came at it from a totally different angle. Their entire foundation rests on a brand new divine revelation. The story goes like this. It starts with a young Joseph Smith having a vision. That leads to an angel showing him where to find these buried golden plates. He then translates those plates into a new scripture, the Book of Mormon, which becomes the blueprint for a whole new religion and a new way of life.
Okay, but it wasn't all just about redefining sex and marriage. Other groups had different ideas. For them, the path to a perfect society was through intellectualism, or through intense religious piety, or by just completely cutting yourself off from the corrupting influence of the outside world. So, let's look at Brook Farm. This place was basically the intellectual's utopia. It was founded by George Ripley, and his big idea was to combine manual labor with deep thinking, create a more whole person. It attracted all the biggest literary stars of the day, but, as the famous author Nathaniel Hawthorne discovered, it's a lot easier to write poetry about shoveling manure than it is to actually shovel it. In this quote right here from the Amana community, it just shows you how deeply they distrusted any kind of worldly pleasure. A wedding, instead of being this joyous celebration, was seen as a day of terror. Why? Because it was a dangerous distraction from what really mattered, a life devoted completely to God.
So yeah, the Amana community, they actually called themselves the community of true inspiration. The whole thing was built on pure, hardcore piety. They believed that God spoke directly through their leaders, so life was incredibly strict. Everyone wore drab, simple clothing to, lessen sex appeal. And they had this intense work ethic, which is pretty ironic because that same work ethic is what eventually turned their spiritual commune into the Amana appliance company we all know today.
And then, of course, there are the Amish. Their vision for a perfect society wasn't about trying to fix the world or reinvent it. It was about leaving it behind completely. Their leader was Jacob Amen, and their core belief is that the only way to live a truly godly life is through total separation from the modern world. And that's a principle they still hold to, right now, today. So how does a group that completely cuts itself off from the rest of the world actually survive, let alone grow? Well, the answer really boils down to this one number: 7. That's the average number of children in an Amish family. So while the celibate groups, like the Shakers, were doomed to fade away, the Amish ensured their own future just by having big families. They created this amazing self-sustaining culture that never needed a single convert from the outside world.
All right, so after all that, what happened to these grand experiments? Did any of them actually pull it off? Did anyone build a perfect society?
Well, the legacies are incredibly diverse. Most of the communes, they eventually failed, but some, like Oneida and Amana, they managed to turn their little community industries into major corporations that are still around today. Silverware and refrigerators. Broke Farm, the intellectual commune, it gave us some classic American literature. The Amish, as we saw, are still thriving. And one group, the Mormons, went from being this small, persecuted sect to a major world religion.
So here's the thing to remember. Even though most of these actual communities are gone, the radical questions they were asking, they haven't gone anywhere. How should we live together? What does the ideal family look like? How do you balance being an individual with the good of the community? These are the exact same questions we're all still wrestling with today.
And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. All of these groups, they were willing to risk absolutely everything to chase their idea of perfection. So what do you think? Was it a noble, inspiring dream, or was it a dangerous fantasy that was always going to fail? The way you answer that, well, it might say just as much about our world today as it does about theirs.